sprinkling or cleansing. And so you are at this time sprinkled with holy water, right? Technically speaking, that's not the beginning of the Mass. That takes place before the Mass begins, okay? Just like many times when we do other things, like let's say, for example, the blessing of the palms on Palm Sunday, some other various different things, usually take place, if they're going to happen at the time of Mass, take place before the Mass begins. So like on Palm Sunday, there's a blessing of palms, and you come up to the communion rail and you receive your blessed palm, and then you go back to your pew, and then the actual Mass begins. And how do you know when the Mass is actually itself, the Mass itself, especially the Mass of the catechumens, how do you know when that is about, when that's happening? No, a little before that. A little before that. You're on the right track. What does Father do after he does the, after Father does the asperges, he comes back up to the altar and he's wearing something that's kind of long and sort of drags the ground, right? We call it the cope. Okay, and then we do the sprinkling, and there are a few prayers, and then Father does what? No, not yet. But what does he do before that? What does he do before that? What does he do after he sprinkles holy water? Do y'all actually go to church once in a while? Come on, my altar servers, you're up there. You know what's going on. What?
He takes off the coat.
I take off the coat, and what? I walk over to the chair, right? And I take off the coat, and I put on the chasuble, and that's your sign that Mass is about to begin. Okay? So we do the asperges before Mass begins. Then when I take off the coat and put on the chasuble, Mass is about to begin, right? And then after I put on the chasuble, I do what?
What prayer? Make the sign of the cross.
I make the sign of the cross, right?
Yeah.
I walk over to the steps or the foot of the altar, and the very first thing I do is make the sign of the cross. And there's a lot of meaning in the sign of the cross. Now, I know a lot of times we get kind of used to making the sign of the cross, and sometimes we get a little sloppy with it. But it's actually a very, very important prayer, and it says a lot about our faith in Jesus Christ in that very simple words and actions of the sign of the cross. Yes, sir?
So when you do the sign of the cross, that begins the Mass?
That begins, the actual Mass itself begins with the sign of the cross, okay? And that should tell us how important the sign of the cross is, or how important the cross itself is, because it's what begins Holy Mass. Okay? So, and then ultimately, at the very end of Holy Mass, what's the very last thing I do before I leave the altar? You really should come to Mass once in a while. No, I don't actually kiss. Kissing the altar is not the very last thing. What's the very last thing I do before I come down off the altar?
I know, what's it called? The very
Well, you're talking about the last gospel. But what do I do before actually you're right, but before the last gospel, when the Mass itself is ending, what takes place?
You bless.
I kiss the altar, and then I do Benedicat vos omnipotens Deus, may Almighty God bless you,
Yeah. And
Pater, Filius, et Spiritus Sanctus, right?
Yep.
So the Mass begins with the sign of the cross, and the Mass ends with the sign of the cross.